While it wasn't as much of a muddy, bloody mess as Europe, World War II's North Africa campaign was certainly not the clean war some propagandists and historians claim it was. While some sources speak of camaraderie between Axis and Allied forces, notably between Germans and British soldiers, it was still a war. Many soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and the campaign was not without its atrocities and war crimes. Of course, it is difficult to tackle this topic without first tackling German Field Marshal Erwin the Desert Fox Rommel. After all, he led the Afrika Korps against the Allies in North Africa, and, in no small part because of propaganda before, during, and after the campaign, became the face of this entire clean war myth, which indeed is very much a constituent of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. In this video, we're going to discuss the myth in greater detail, focusing on chivalrous, honourable Rommel and his Afrika Korps. Before we delve any deeper, it's worth summarising the North African campaign quickly. The campaign started following Italy's declaration of war on the 10th of June 1940, soon after which British forces invaded Italian Libya and took Fort Capuzzo. The Italians then waged a counter-offensive into Egypt and captured Sidi Barrani, and this counter-offensive was met with yet another counter-offensive known officially as Operation Compass, in which the Brits and their allies all but obliterated the Italians. Wishing to retain some sort of foothold, Hitler deployed Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps in North Africa in February 1941. It was now very much Rommel against the British generals, and following a series of battles, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery was able to crush Rommel's Afrika Korps in the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, scattering its remnants into Tunisia, where, after some battles yet, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. This victory set the Allies up for the Italian campaign, which eventuated in the collapse of fascist Italy. While Rommel made some pretty questionable orders back in France, setting fires to civilian housing and pretending to surrender to French troops just to bait them into a trap, to name a few, the atrocities and war crimes he and his Afrika Korps committed in North Africa were largely against Jews and POWs. Despite their defeat in El Alamein, the Afrika Korps retained a grip on North Africa until after Operation Torch, and during this time, the Corps was anything but clean. In November, for instance, the Corps participated in a massacre in the Libyan city of Benghazi, in which 67 Jews were slain. But that was just the start. The Corps also advised their Italian allies on establishing concentration camps in Libya, such as the city of Benghazi itself, and deporting Jews en masse to Italy. In these Libyan camps, some 3,500 Jews were detained and some 600 of them perished. While in Tunisia, a North African country between Algeria and Libya, Rommel allowed his corps to plunder Jewish ghettos, such as those in the towns of Tunis, and blackmail Jews into paying some 90 million francs toward the German war effort. On top of this, Rommel had his men assist the Italians in establishing concentration camps and deporting Jews to Italy, where they were forced to labor, similarly to what happened in Libya. Also while in Tunisia, Rommel cooperated with notorious war criminal SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Rauff, facilitating forced labor and genocide. For some context, Rauff was one of the Nazis involved in the design and implementation of mobile gas vans, in which victims suffocated for up to 20 minutes before finally succumbing to the fumes. More to the point, the SS unit under Rauff's command was known as Einsatzgruppe Egypt, and it was tasked with the eradication of Jews in Egypt and Palestine. Einsatzgruppe, however, was small and therefore needed muscle to complete its disgusting task. This is where Rommel and his Afrika Korps come in, forcing Jews to build fortifications for the Corps and concentration camps for thousands of other Jews to die in. Even as far back as July 1942, Rommel was giving orders to Rauff, telling him to murder all the Jews of Palestine after the Afrika Korps had taken the state. Thankfully, Rommel never made it past El Alamein. Lastly, the Afrika Korps also murdered some 500 Jewish German and Jewish Austrian POWs of the Jewish Brigade, an all-Jewish unit of the British Army. While Rommel's involvement in this massacre remains unclear, these were troops under his command. So, if Rommel and his Afrika Korps did all this, why would anybody think they fought a clean war against the Allies in the North African campaign? The answer is many-layered, though it mostly comes down to propaganda on both sides, both during and after World War II. During World War II, at least while the Germans were winning, Rommel was a German hero, with his exploits amplified or straight up falsified for the Nazi Party's Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels and other propagandists, and he was sold as Hitler's favourite general and an all-round solid Aryan. It didn't take long for Allied media to catch wind, painting Rommel as a chivalrous, honourable soldier and a keen military mind, to whom losing was justified, and over whom victory was doubly as sweet. Rommel and Goebbels were stoked with this turn of events, with the propaganda minister writing, "Rommel continues to be the recognised darling of even the enemy's news agencies." When things were going bad for the Germans in other theatres of war, Rommel and his Afrika Korps' victories in the North African campaign were equally as useful to the propaganda minister, who used North Africa to distract the German people. And when the North African campaign itself took a turn for the worse, Goebbels saw to it that someone other than Rommel took responsibility for the defeat, as to the German people, Rommel was invincible, and Goebbels had uses for him yet. After Rommel was implicated in the 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler, whether he was actually involved or not, he took his own life, and Goebbels attributed the field marshal's deaths to injuries he sustained in a car accident earlier that month. Another twist of the truth. But the propaganda didn't end with Rommel's death, nor the end of the war. The idea of the chivalrous, honourable Desert Fox lived on in Allied nations, and mostly because their propagandists needed to slap a new and lovable face on the defeated Wehrmacht, whose rehabilitation they believed essential to staving off their next perceived threat, the USSR. In short, a West German army couldn't be raised as an additional shield against the Soviets unless ex-Wehrmacht soldiers were free to fill the army's ranks. Seeing as the Allies had only just demilitarized Germany, and seeing as the wounds of the Second World War were still very fresh, Allied propagandists knew they needed to paint the new German army in a different light to win over the public. To this end, Rommel was basically used as, in the words of historian Peter Caddick-Adams, an acceptable face for German militarism. For their intents, he was a good German who stood apart from the Nazi regime. Other works painting Rommel in this light soon followed, with some of the most notorious including journalistic pieces such as those of British historian Sir B.H. Liddell-Hart, biographies such as Rommel, the Desert Fox, published in 1950, other textual works such as the Rommel Papers, which are supposedly the collective writings of Rommel himself, and which Liddell-Hart worked on with a former Wehrmacht officer, and films such as The Desert Fox, the story of Rommel. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Western Allies were pretty much done with Rommel, and it should come as no shock that it was from the 90s onward that the chivalrous, honourable Desert Fox became a thing of myth more than fact, spearheaded by 1990s journalistic pieces and later publications and productions such as Maurice Philip Remy's Mythos Rommel, the documentary of the same name, which was released in 2002, and Ralph Georg Ruth's Rommel, Das Ende einer Legende, which was published in 2004. These other works poked some holes in the veil and allowed us to glimpse at the truth of Rommel, his Afrika Korps, and the clean North African campaign. Now, before we conclude, it's worth noting that we've only discussed the atrocities and war crimes aspects of the Rommel myth, with his political stance and his skill as a commander being the remaining two aspects to explore, not to mention what he got up to after North Africa. Also, in regards to the North African campaign, it should be noted that clean needn't only regard a purported absence of atrocities and war crimes, and the combat itself was tough, only exacerbated by the desert environment and the logistical nightmares it occasioned. The desert sun did not burn moral nor physical perversions away. Human beings were still horrible, and you best believe they suffered a plethora of injuries, diseases, and other such stresses. And just a quick personal note, deviating from the script a little bit here, I personally think Rommel was one of the better generals of the German army, and although there's a lot of myths surrounding him and a lot of black and white views of the man, I must emphasize that life exists in the greys, not the black and whites. But this video, like all videos on our channel, is just to help give you insight into how black and white some people view history. Rommel wasn't all good, but nor was he all bad. It was the same with the Wehrmacht, and we posted a video about them too. They weren't all committing atrocities out there. Some were just Germans that were trying to get through it and, you know, fight for their country. So just wanted to emphasize that it's all about the gray area, and this video is one that we're trying to show the opposite side of Rommel that not everybody was aware of. But in saying that, we're interested to know, did you know about the myths of Rommel, his Africa Corps, and the North African campaign before this video? Maybe you think what we've said here is BS and want to share evidence that contradicts us. Maybe you want to share something that strengthens what we've said. Please put all your thoughts down in the comment section below. And just before you go, guys, make sure you check out our wider history community on our Facebook, Instagram, and Discord, where we post exclusive content on all 3 of these platforms. Anyways, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.